So this week is going to be fun. These videos are going to be cool. And there's a little bit of a challenge because, well, you might have guessed, this is the week where I am going to actually accomplish another rotation of the sun. Complete another trip around it. It happens every year. It's quite disturbing. But I want you to guess which video is actually coming out on the day. I'd be really interested to see which one of the videos you think, as it is one of the recorded videos and not the live. One of the recorded videos, and there'll be 4 this week. I'll do this beginning of each of them. One of them's coming out on my actual birthday. Let's see if you can guess which topic I chose for my birthday. Or possibly was assisted in choosing for my birthday, thanks to the way events worked out. Anyway, if Admirals Henderson and William Fisher survived through World War II, what would their roles and impact be? Well, this is going to be an alternate history. But as usual with alternate histories, it's going to be looking at the history right up until we get to the Shameless book plug, and then the alternate side is going to be, alternate stuff is going to be mostly after the Shameless book plug. So, if you want to learn some history about it, please do keep watching. If you don't like alternate history, Shameless book plug comes on, please watch the Shameless book plug, and then don't watch the rest. If you don't like... I will never understand the people who watch the alternate histories and comment on them, and there are the same people who do it almost every single time. And they usually do add in swear words so that they don't get made public comments, because my channel's little cousin safe. Being annoyed that I do alternate histories, and I go, A, these are patron videos, these are patron requested topics, and B, and most importantly, B, they are quite interesting bits of history. It's quite interesting to work through and think about it, because it's how do the personalities, how do the people impact things. If you don't want to watch it though, you're on YouTube. There's like billions of videos out there. Surely you can find something else to watch that's not going to make you so angry and upset. Why would you watch something to make you angry and upset? I don't understand it. Anyway, the officers in question are quite interesting. Now, William Wordsworth Fisher, I can't find a picture that I'm allowed to use. I have now a couple of pictures I'm allowed to use for Henderson, but I still prefer this one. But I can't find a picture for Fisher that I'm allowed to use. You can Google him, and you will find pictures of him, but I haven't got one that I'm allowed to use at the moment. I'm trying to hunt one down, because he's quite a cool officer to talk about and quite a cool officer to get into. And we're going to start by talking about what happens with them, what they get, and why they aren't available. Because there's going to be a bit of a theme we're going to be talking about in this video, and that is the Royal Navy losing its senior officers in the run-up to World War II. And the fact that quite so many of them have fatal events. Now, Henderson, he was Rear Admiral Aircraft Carriers, theoretically 21st of September 1931 to the 15th of September 1933. And prior to this, the post had been a captain aircraft rather than a Rear Admiral. And there is a big difference in that, in the status level of how much staff you have, what capabilities you have, etc. However, Henderson had been involved in writing and developing the new role, so we often date his actual tenure from 1930. In a great tradition of Royal Navy officers, and it is a great tradition of Royal Navy officers, the guy who was writing the standards for the future post decided that the person who perfectly fitted the bill for that future post was him, and managed to swing it. This has happened several times with Royal Navy, even up to recently to the brand new aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth class carriers. The guy who was put in charge of hunting and deciding on who the first captain of Queen Elizabeth would be, the guy who was going to set the standards for the future aircraft carriers, well, imagine, just amazingly, the man in charge of the process decided to select himself to be the first captain of Queen Elizabeth. He was the best candidate for the job, and they had chosen someone who had a lot of experience to select the right person for the role. So yeah, I just find it amazing how often that happens in the Royal Navy. It's almost like we're selecting the person who probably should be doing the role, but we're going to make sure they want it by having them select themselves. Yeah. He officially takes over as Third Sea Lord in 1934, but he was assigned to learn the role after leading the carrier role, and he pretty much takes the lead in December 1930 as Forbes, who was his predecessor, has to start handling stuff to do with the first battle squadron, as due to commitments, Admiral Fisher, who was in that role, was overstretched. He's actually promoted to Admiral on the 14th of January 1939, and would probably have stayed Third Sea Lord till at least probably May, June 1940, if not for that. The fact he's promoted to Admiral doesn't surprise me, but he's served, therefore, the whole of his rank of Vice Admiral as Third Sea Lord. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on, Alex, that means he lacks sea time. He's been doing all sorts of things and actually been managing to rack up a bit of sea time in that time and doing all sorts of duties. And at this point now, he is pretty much acknowledged as one of the political powerhouses the Royal Navy has on it. So they need him to go off and do a C&C post before they can make him First Sea Lord. He's on that track. It's not an unusual track for First Sea Lords to be on a track to being First Sea Lord. He's had to be in post for a long time. Usually you serve Third Sea Lord for 3 years. So he should have had his post over in 1937. It's doubled. And it's doubled because he's quite so valuable in the role and he's quite so capable in the role. But that means he's pretty much built the fleet. And he knows it backwards and forwards of strategic position, because the Third Sea Lord's role is to take the strategic consensus and the strategic possibilities that the Royal Navy might face, and over the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and conceive the fleet that's going to be able to face them. The infrastructure, the technologies. He has to oversee all of that. Literally, when you ask the question, who built the Royal Navy for World War II, you point to this one, gentlemen. Because all of the modern ships you're facing, all the modern ships which come into service during and the beginning of and just prior to and even are based, the designs that are built during are based on, are his designs, his work, his conceptions. The one outside of that is the King George V's having 14-inch guns. Literally, that is owed to a previous First Sea Lord called Chatfield, who was has a long run of being an interesting choice. He'd been Admiral Beatty's flag captain, and he has a good, powerful connections, and he does have some very interesting roles in him in future service. But look, it's when you read his Chatfield's autobiography and you find that Henderson is minimally in there, despite his role, and then you go check the actual archive documents and you find out all the stuff that Henderson was doing, it's not going, someone's been massaging history. But there again, as the old saying goes, especially about autobiographies, recollections may vary. Recollections may vary. Fisher, well, Sir William Wordsworth Fisher. Oh, I forgot to mention with Henderson, dies from potentially a stroke. A few years ago, Dan Freeman, Dr. Dan from Shipshape Crew, who is one of my admins, but also has his own channel and is, part of the team which works with me and Drac. Because I talk about Henderson so often, did quite a big deep dive into Henderson and his symptoms, and really much thinks it's some form of stroke from some of the symptoms given. He can't be sure, and the medical diagnosis at the time, they're not quite sure what's going on. So yeah, it with modern understanding of medicine, based on symptoms, that's Dan's suspicion. And from doing the reading, which I have done since Dan suggested that, and the more I've looked at it, the more I would agree with Dan's opinion. But I'm a historian, Dan's the medical doctor, and neither of us were examining Fisher, examining Henderson at the time. But yeah, could well have been that. And then we have Fisher. Well, Fisher, his prior experience. He'd been a Rear Admiral 1st Battle Squadron when there wasn't a Vice Admiral there, so he'd been actually in charge of 1st Battle Squadron, and the first one really to take charge of after World War I. So, fairly useful. Director of Naval Intelligence, 4th Sea Lord and Chief of Supplies and Transport, Deputy Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral commanding 1st Battle Squadron, CNC Mediterranean, and was the CNC in Portsmouth. So let's see, he is an experienced Director of Naval Intelligence, he is an experienced Logistics Officer and Supplies Officer, in charge, literally 4th Sea Lord in charge of Supplies and Transport, which was the 4th Sea Lord's role at that point. Deputy Chief of Naval Staff, and an experienced Commanding Officer and Commander-in-Chief. I can't understand why Marder thinks Fisher was likely to have been 1st Sea Lord had he still been alive. Had he not died not rather suddenly, whilst on holiday at the coast, age 62, whilst having passed his physical and being apparently in perfect health. Now, the thing is, Fisher is also one of, whilst Henderson is the guy who builds the fleet, Fisher is one of the guys who molds the fleet, and one of his obsessions is night fighting. They are both quite heavy proponents of the large, powerful destroyer in their own ways. They are both quite heavy proponents of air power in its own ways and night fighting capability. They're also both quite strong political operators when it comes to the UK political scenario. They have experience in roles where they have to deal with politicians, 3rd Sea Lord in the case of Henderson, and prior roles to that. For Fisher had been 4th Sea Lord, but also Director of Naval Intelligence. They have a lot of capabilities when it comes to managing the various political departments of the UK and arguing back and making their case for them. These are two very strong personalities you would be having to that would have been in power and would have been heading the Navy in terms of the naval service. Now, the thing is, Fisher wouldn't have become 1st Sea Lord till September 1938. So basically, everything as history would continue as it was, because it wouldn't change until September 1938. And instead of Sir Roger Backhouse, who is not a bad guy, probably would have been the 2nd Sea Lord, which would have meant Charles Little would have been free for a different appointment after leaving the China Station, so could have got all sorts of things. There are options around. But honestly, it gets more interesting the more deeper you go into this, because, well... Okay, we look at the First Lords in this scenario, in this period. Here's a really bit of interesting coincidence, okay? Sir Roger Blackhouse becomes the First Sea Lord, the senior Royal Navy officer. And he serves in that post from September 1938 till July 1939, when he dies of a brain tumour, suddenly. Sir Dudley Pound then takes over till he dies of most likely a brain tumour in 1943. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by inclination, but the sheer number of senior officers dying from brain tumours and other issues with your issues to do with your brain chemistry, things like strokes, etc. They're all up there in the head, to do with the arteries up there usually. The thing is, That's a lot. It's a pretty high incidence. Now, yes, these are men who are all working hard. In the case of Henderson, there is a very good argument that he worked himself to death. The stress, he put himself under the pressure he was putting himself under to deliver the fleet, to fight back against the people who were putting forward some very silly arguments, and to constantly having to wage a battle to defend things like naval aviation from politicians, tankers, getting the proper foundations built at Singapore, having enough cruisers, enough destroyers. All these things is a constant war. But honestly, when you start to look at the health records and his health, he was pretty darn healthy up until about 6 to 8 months before he dies. And it's that sort of period he starts to seem to be worn out. It seems to have issues. And it's pretty much the same for all of them, barring Fisher, who seemed to be in perfect health, etc., and suddenly dies at the age of 62. Henderson, by the way, was 57. Henderson was 57. Fisher, 62. None of the officers involved we're talking about were very old by our standard. None of them were very old by our standards. Now, the First Lords are doing a lot of duties at this point, but the trouble is you do go from having Fisher, who was probably a fairly capable political fighter, to Backhouse, who was, how do I put this politely, was not the same level as Fisher was when it comes to politics. And certainly Pound wasn't. And Pound didn't expect to become a Sea Lord when he did. The normal post is roughly 3 years. You take over in September 1938. No one's expecting to relieve you till September 1941. In peacetime rules, it's normally roughly 3 years in post. 3-4 years. And with Pound, well, he takes over in July 1943. July 1939. And dies in 1943, not long after he's left post. Not long after he's left post. And we all know the PQ-17 and other things that go on. Well, the thing is, these men are working very, very hard. But quite literally, at this point, being a senior officer in the Royal Navy seems to be positively lethal for your health. And to put this aside, we can also put Adm Somerville, who is the Royal Navy's radio, radar, everything expert at the Admiral level, who has to fall out the Royal Navy because he's so ill. He's medically retired. He's called back to assist with Operation Dynamo and these things. We'll talk about that as time goes on in this video. But, he was medically retired for the good of his health. The really big problem with these officers going is it leaves officers like, well, the 51-year-old Rear Admiral Bruce Fraser, who was literally appointed 3rd Sea Lord in March 1939, to go toe-to-toe with Winston Churchill, who was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in September 1939. And we have to remember decisions he makes when he comes in. The fact that you pause carriers, you pause capital ships, you pause cruisers, because you have to focus on escorts, because he will not believe the Royal Navy has focused on escorts, and they've been building them. And Fraser doesn't have the experience in his post, doesn't have, I would say, the political capabilities that Henderson has built up over his years of service, and doesn't have, this is going to sound terrible, but he's a good leader in many, many ways. But This is him later on when he's in charge of the Pacific Fleet. About 4 or 5 years later. This is Henderson. One is a very, very good officer. The other is a once-in-a-generation mind. Fisher is also pretty darn good. One of these is what I would say once-in-a-generation organizational mind, and the other one's a once-in-a-generation tactical mind, in terms of Fisher. Organization, construction, that's going to be Henderson. Henderson and Fisher both have a bit of an intelligence background. They both serve with various things. They both got various extensive experience serving around in the Royal Navy around the world. They've got extensive political experience and capabilities. These were good, solid naval officers. They were fine choices for their post. But I don't think they were the first choices for their post. The first choices, or rather the ones who were expected to be the first choices, were no longer options. And Fraser is not bad. Fraser, if he'd been able to be taken on in March 1939 under Henderson's wing, as is the normal way for these things, and by the time that Henderson disappears off in 1940, Fraser has had 9 months or 12 months of training. Well, that's a very different Fraser, isn't it? That's a Fraser who's been taught how to do the job. Instead, this was a Fraser who came in, picked up the job, was everything dropped in. There's a Henderson-sized hole, and he's a fresh-faced Rear Admiral, and he has to try and fill it. And everything pretty much drops on Stanley Goodall, the Director of Naval Construction. Everything pretty much drops on him. But it has to, because he's the experienced hand. And then Churchill comes along. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, the great lion of British politics, the roarer who won't stop roaring, and he tells you to do things, and you have to argue against him. And you've been on the job for 6 months? Yeah. This is why I don't hold anything against Fraser for what happens. I don't hold anything against any of the people in the Admiralty for what happens, realistically. The decision comes from Churchill. He's the one who proposed it. There's also the decisions about aircraft procurement. He's the one who actually argues in favour of the RAF and the RAF's rules about changing aircraft, because as he goes, we're fighting just Germany. We don't need carrier aircraft to fight Germany. And no one in the Admiralty is strong enough politically to go round him or to confront him, realistically, in this time, at this session. Because they don't operate at that level. The ones who are being trained to operate at the level, to confront people at that level, are pretty much all dead. There are often discussions about what happens, whether it is a conspiracy theory, whether there was someone going around killing them. I'm not sure, but there are arguments for who it works out best for. There are lots of winners in that scenario, with those sets of admirals dying. In fact, so many it makes it kind of complicated to try and work out who might be pushing for it. But that's history. There's also the fact that they were literally working themselves to death. They were. They were pushing every sinew they had to make up for the gaps the treaties had created in the naval force structure. And there's only so much the human body can take. Only so much effort anybody can manage. Now the question, often once we start talking about them, because Fisher's obvious, he's going to be First Sea Lord. But if we're talking about Henderson, and they survive through World War II, where are they? What are they going to do? Where are they going to be? Well, the options in 1940 that Henderson could find himself given the option of Fisher as first Sea Lord, of course, and probably would stay as first Sea Lord for as long as they need him to. And the question was if they survived through World War II. So Fisher's first Sea Lord. But what is Henderson? Historically, James Somerville, called back after being invalided out of the service due to illness, is put in charge of Force H. Normally, an independent command at that level should go to an admiral, but the Royal Navy was kind of running on a shortage of them. Now, yes, normally with Henderson, you'd think he'd go off to become China Station. That was certainly what, if peace had continued, and he had still been alive in 1940, I have no doubt he gets sent to the China Station. After all, Japan is still the threat the active threat they're managing. Germany is aggressive and growing. Italy's punctilious and annoying, but Japan is pointing guns at us, and we're pointing guns back at them. Where do you send your admiral who has extensive experience with construction, analysis, and intelligence, as well as diplomacy and politics, to go and manage? You send him to the China Station. Normally, he'd probably do that for roughly 3 or so years, maybe a little less, and then he might well be given Mediterranean or Home Fleet, and then probably First Sea Lord. So you'd probably be expecting him to be heading for First Sea Lord in his early 60s. Again, nothing unusual. Nothing unusual in that scenario. It might be earlier. It's going to depend on what happens. If he goes off in 1940, it's not going to line up probably with when Fisher's going to go, that he would succeed Fisher. But who's Fisher going to be succeeded by? There is a chance it's going to be Cunningham on that timeline, who's just heading out to the Mediterranean Fleet at this point. In 1939, so yeah, there are options in terms of what. Usually, it's one of the CNC's Med or Home Fleet who will go jump up, and they'll have done that before they become Commander in Chief, or before they become First Sea Lord. So usually, you go off and get some naval experience, and then you become one of the big CNCs, and then you get promoted up. That's the commonish sort of pathway. Sort of commonish pathway. There are variations on it. But this is wartime. And whilst I could still very much see Somerville being called back to assist with Dynamo, the fact is, you can send Henderson out to the China Station. You could still send, the officer Leighton, who was historically sent out there, and you could give Somerville a different posting. Somerville could go be in charge of radar development and technological development, which he'd be very good at. Or maybe you give him a deputy fleet command somewhere. There are lots of areas where Somerville could be put to very good use as a very useful Vice Admiral. But the thing is, there's an option here for an Admiral. And this is going to be a discussion we'll talk through in this video. But it's the thing is, to my mind, it's going to be affected by what's going to be available. Because, as I've been trying to emphasize through, the difference you've got between Fisher and Henderson in first and third roles versus Fraser and Pound is experience in those roles and experience with political battles. And that makes a difference in how necessarily Churchill, but also the cabinet and various decisions might be taken in the early months of the war. Now, that does mean there's going to be a bit of a limit to this alternate history. And before we get to the book plug, I'm going to admit that there is going to be a bit of a limit to this alternate history. There is only so far I can talk about before it stops being an alternate history and starts being completely fiction. I.e., me basing supposition upon supposition upon supposition. But I think I can get you quite decently into 1940 without it becoming so many butterflies that, frankly, it's just me going into this is what I believe would happen. And as I've said before, alternate history is often about playing the odds and the averages. It's working out what should happen so you can work out why it didn't happen and what decisions actually matter. Because if the same thing happens no matter what a decision is taken, then obviously the decision which made that thing happen is not one of those decisions you're thinking about. That's literally a historical technique to work through and go, well, hang on, that would still happen if this happened, that would still happen if this happened, that would still happen. Okay, so what I'm looking at are not the factors which affect this event happening, because it happens no matter what. So where is the factor that's causing this to happen? With that being said, Shameless book plug time. So, Shameless book plug. Chance for me to say thank you. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for helping it grow. Thank you for helping it head towards this year's target of 20,000 subscribers. Oh, good lord. Who knows? We might even achieve it. Who knows? It's about it's about 5,200 away. So there's a chance there. There's a chance. 52 weeks in the year, and I'm already a third of the way through. So yeah, not much chance. But we'll see. We'll see. Thank you to everyone who likes, shares, subscribes to the channel. Thank you for everyone who's a member, who's a patron, who does super chats and super thanks. Without you, this channel will not be where it is, because, well, yeah, we all have the same issues these days. None of us can do anything for free, no matter how much we want to. I can afford to spend the days I do on this channel and doing historical research and writing the books because of the support you give me. That's it. Otherwise, I'd have to spend my time doing those days doing consultancy work and contract lecturing. And I like those jobs, I do, but they don't allow me to share history with a lot of people. They really don't. And I like sharing history with a lot of people. I like sharing the discussions. I like inviting people to think and enjoy the history and enjoy learning the history, because whilst, yes, learning for the sake of learning it can be an enjoyable thing for many, learning for the sake of understanding and for helping you develop your skills to analyze situations you might find yourselves in, that is useful. That is a useful skill to have, and that's what I want this channel to promote. So thank you. And yeah, fun times. So let's consider the first thing. When we talk about large destroyers, when we talk about the various options which are laid down, Fisher and Henderson are more aggressive. They're going to be more aggressive. If you combine them not getting ill, them not being ill, and them being there is an argument, are Lion and Temeraire really laid down in February 1939, or are they, with the slightly earlier design, laid down in late 1938? There is a chance for these things to be laid down earlier, but it's very difficult. You have to move a lot of things around. You have to change some of the commercial builds. So it's unlikely. But saying that, there are options here. There are options which need to be considered. For starters, there's the L-class destroyer. I've got out my old picture, which shows that various options being given. There's the tribal, there's the class before it, the very nice, very cute J class destroyer, which was under construction time, and then you have the L 44,000, as it's called, a class. It's called 44, and the L class 77,000, and the options, the main options. Henderson was pushing the large one. Pretty much, it's one of the compromises. He gets pretty much everything he wants, but the L class, with the people he's dealing with at the time when they're selecting the L class destroyer and pushing it, the whole issues going on, it's the smaller option which is taken. It's the smaller option. I think with both Fisher and Henderson, I think you have the larger destroyer. I also think you probably have Indefatigable and Unicorn laid down a bit earlier in 1939 than they were historically. And I think possibly you have Lion and Temeraire also actually laid down, because one of the things that slows them down is the ordering of the material for them. The thing is, when Henderson is around, is really at his dominance in 1933, 38, it's a 38 period, rather than 1939, as he does die in May 1939. He's succeeded by Fraser in March 1939, and in January 1939 he's too ill to go to the palace to get an award and get to see his promotion to Admiral. So pretty much he drops off really in 1939. That's when his illness gets really bad. What's affecting it? And, well, when we start looking at that period, if he's not going, if he's got Fisher joining him in September 1938, Fisher, who does support the larger destroyer idea, who is going to take a more active political approach in terms of securing funding, well, Henderson has form for, if he cannot get the materials in the UK, he'll get them wherever he can. If he can get them from the Empire, great. If he can get armor from Czechoslovakia, he'll take it. If he can get the materials from wherever he needs to get in the world, he will go and get it, because he's got the money for it. What's holding him back is the industrial capacity having to be redeveloped because of the various decisions made by previous governments to literally pay for yards to close down and other things to close down, because they were all about rejuvenating industry for the new industry and putting people into the new industry. There's a classic discussion where Henderson literally walked into a yard to discuss procuring ships from them. As the same time as he walked in, there were people walking out from the Treasury who had just been discussing with the yard owners paying for them to shut down and to put in a rule which that land could never be used as a yard ever again. It might be an apocryphal account. There's only literally one source, and it isn't from Henderson. It was someone else describing the third Sea Lord at the time, and in that particular period it has to be Henderson. Wasn't happy with them. Thankfully, that yard didn't close down. Thankfully, it didn't. But there are a lot of things which could be changed with this. If you're pushing in larger destroyers, they're easier to upgrade during the war. If you're pushing forward, again, there's actually a delay caused by Henderson dying, with the orders being placed for things like the Flower class and the Hunt class the Hunt class escort destroyers, the Flower class corvettes. There are issues. There's issues, I would argue, to an extent, the Hunt class can be placed down to the fact that there was issues with the senior officers at the top, because Henderson knows the questions to ask, but he's not around to ask them, and the Hunt class, yeah, mistakes are made. Mistakes are made in the scaling and the adaptation of the design. These things, with a fully worked up Henderson, with him getting in Fraser as an assistant and training him up, and all these things going on, That might not happen. They also might have started those orders a little bit earlier. Henderson was certainly wanting to. In many ways, he was hamstrung by the fact that Black House was not as confrontational a first sea lord, politically confrontational first sea lord as he probably needed at the time, whereas it's arguable Fisher would have been more confrontational. And please note I'm saying politically confrontational. That doesn't mean having a screaming match or threatening to resign or any of those other grandiose schemes. That means being able to put the argument in a way which is going to be inherently attractive to the politicians. Black House is very good at stating the case for something. He's not very good at stating the political case for something. Fisher can do that. Fisher had to do a huge amount of that as 4th Sea Lord in his time. Look at the things he did as a 4th Sea Lord. So, yeah. I think with those two combined, you get the L class, the larger one. I think you probably get more of them ordered than a historic number. I also think you're looking at an earlier order for probably at least the Flower class, maybe even the Hunt class. And I'm not talking a massively earlier, I'm talking roughly 3 months earlier order, and moving the orders back 3 months. Which does have an impact on things. It does have an impact on the availability of vessels, especially earlier on in the war. And I think, again, you have similar scenarios where Lion and Temeraire, they might still be ordered in February 1939, but I wouldn't be surprised if the long lead items have been ordered earlier, and those ships are going to be built quickly. I would also not be surprised with the same for Implacable, Indefatigable, and Unicorn. There is no surprise that Implacable is laid down in March 1939 after Fraser is actually put into post, because it's literally been on pause whether or not to lay her down because of the lack of a 3rd Sea Lord realistically doing the role, because the Navy's didn't want to replace Henderson until they had to, and it was touch and go and all these things of who was going to be stepping up, etc. So that is literally roughly a 2-3 month construction period is lost because of Henderson's illness and the time taken for Fraser to get involved. So that alone has an impact. Add in a more politically confrontational 1st Sea Lord, and I think whilst you don't get a dramatically different in terms of quantity, the Royal Navy's not going to suddenly order 1,000 submarines or something like that. I can see the orders you get put in place are going to be slightly earlier, because there is the yard space, there are the facilities, there is the stuff if you're prepared to mobilize it, if you're prepared to mobilize and mobilize political capital to push for it, and I think you would get the larger destroyers. Now that's interesting, because this L class would have been larger than a Tribal. They would have been the next generation of big destroyers, and please note, as part of their construction, they have the dual-purpose 4-5. That was what was planned for them. Those turrets are no surprise. They are dual-purpose 4-5s. They do look like the later Daring turrets for a reason. Now, again, I think the two of them would be pushing for that. But if you do have the L class and you want to put 4-5s on them and you don't have the 4-5s available, they actually are large enough that you can probably fit 3 of the capital ship twin 4-5 mounts, the BD mounts, on them without too much effort. They are that much bigger. So you could get something which was a battle class equivalent coming into service in 1940. But this time with 6 4.5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes and all those things added in. That'd be an interesting asset to have coming into service in 1940, considering how good the 4-5 was. The BD mount gives you a very good dual-purpose system. Add in enough Bofors, maybe take off one of those sets of torpedoes, add in more Bofors, or maybe leave them on. You've got a very good all-round general purpose asset. A very good all-round general purpose asset. And it's, again, there's nothing wrong necessarily with the L-class design as chosen. It's just the smaller option, which means it doesn't have as much space. It doesn't have as much ability to be manipulated, to be changed. And as originally they were built, they end up with the 6 quick-firing 4.7-inch Mark 11 dual-purpose ones, which it's what I sometimes refer to as the Crichton turret of the 4.7-inch wad, because it's got those sort of funny angles. But the trouble is, when I use that phraseology, then the Royal Navy then came out with an actual Crichton turret for their 4.5, a single 4.5, not that long ago, which then kind of ruined that analogy, because everyone calls that the Crichton turret, because it does look far more like the Crichton. And Crichton, by the way, is a character from Red Dwarf, a British science fiction comedy show. And it just cruel. Just cruel to me. But they could have ended up with that as well. But again, being bigger, be able to give the vessel more stability, giving the firepower more stability, is going to help that gun in its work. It's going to help it. So there are some really good options in going for the larger destroyers. There's a really good option also if they do order more, because historically the L and M classes, as they become, and they are good vessels, but they historically amount for 16 vessels. If the Royal Navy had ordered 24, again, that's not going to stretch the production facilities in the UK. They built 2 at Yarrows, 2 at Camellards, 2 at Hawthorne Leslie, 2 at Scots for the L's. For the M's, they built 2 at Scots, 2 at Fairfield, 2 at Alexander Stevens, and 2 at Vickers Armstrong. You've got space. There are yards which are not mentioned here which could build vessels. White's, for example, which did have some space and capacity. JS White's did have space and capacity. That wasn't being used at that time. I know, because the moment there's the emergency order, the war emergency vessels, those yards start to fill up. So there is spare capacity in the system they could have crammed in. They could have ordered another 8. Would it have been a funding issue? Potentially there would have been an issue getting the money for it. But also, again, 8 more destroyers ordered in 1938. November, December 1938, March 1939, laid down sort of time. And, adding in more to be ordering in 1939, it's not a difficult sell. If you're prepared to politically confront the government, you can make it. And Henderson had been doing that. The reason Henderson gets HMS Unicorn built, gets their agreed and everything, she's a forward aviation support ship, and he beds her in so well that despite her being laid down after he has died, she's still done, because he's bedded her in. And he's claimed that she's not an aircraft carrier. He gets her through. And she's critical to the war, and she's, of course, the basis. Her design study and her design forms the basis of the light fleet carriers and their whole program. And it makes sense. She herself comes from an offshoot, a design study, which is an offshoot of a Royal Navy design study, which Henderson had overseen. All those levels had been overseen by Henderson, all those design studies. Rather like these destroyers. This is a design study. This is the sort of thing, when you go and get the files from the archives on design studies, these are the sort of things you find in them. Silhouettes of ships, to give you an example of what they'd look like. So yeah, I think if you've got a first and a third Sea Lord who are both politically confrontational, you probably get more. You probably get more of what you've got historically. You probably are in a slightly better, not a massively improved. I mean, I'm not talking the Royal Navy's going to be running around with extra. I said hundreds of extra escorts or things and those, but the thing is, what you win, you probably win better. You probably still win what you traditionally won, but you win it more strongly than you did historically. That's the differential. That's going to be the change. Which leads us to August 1939 to November 1939 period. Now, here is when things start to potentially change, realistically, because one of the things you find in history, and this is a quirk which is common to all nations, all services, the people who write the doctrines and the operational standards and the concepts are also the people who are often most likely and most confident to throw them completely out the window if they decide the situation requires it. The people who don't write the doctrine tend to stick to it either like glue or try and interpret it in ways that benefit them and argue that they were doing the right thing after they've done it, rather than wholeheartedly change it. They try and implement it badly. History's fun, what can I say? So, there are a few things that go on in this period. One of them is, of course, Winston Churchill. Now, I could talk about that a lot, and I'm going to. But I'm going to start off with the ship decisions. Historically, in this period, Courageous is lost in September 1939. Now, she's lost off hunting submarines. And Ark Royal's off hunting submarines. And yes, the Royal Navy doctrine is to use aircraft carriers to support hunting groups going out hunting submarines. They are supposed to be provided with proper escort for it, but, they were following doctrine. In any scenario where the former Rear Admiral aircraft carriers is still 3rd Sea Lord, and is alive, kicking and breathing, and this comes across anywhere near him as an operational instruction, and he would have heard about it, I think the phrase harikiri probably ascribes to what would have happened to the people who were trying to suggest it. Because whilst he'd written that doctrine, there are criteria for that doctrine. Now, what does that mean they're doing with them? Well, I think he probably finds another role so they don't get that. So what would he be suggesting? How would he... After all, he's not in charge of operations. But 3rd Sea Lord and a full Admiral still has a lot of power within the Navy. And I think there are enough issues going on around the world with hunting the Graf Spee and potentially dealing with a breakout by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, that you need those carriers off doing other duties. I could see Courageous finding herself sent down to, or even Ark Royal actually, sent down to the South Atlantic to support Commodore Harwood. I mean, Harwood can end up with an aircraft carrier with his group, which would be a very interesting scenario for the Battle of the River Plate. Because it's obvious you do need a carrier down in there with the hunting groups, and whilst yes they do have Hermes wandering around supporting the French, that's not really enough, and Ark Royal does need to work up properly. She needs space to work up properly. It's far easier for her to do it down in the South Atlantic, far away from German submarines, than for her to do it up in the North Atlantic or wherever the submarines are, isn't it? So it's far better for her to go down there and work up. And with Courageous, again, something else will be found. I am sure they would be actively employed. I'm just sure that the doctrine would not be implemented of them going and hunting submarines. Which means probably Courageous isn't lost, at least not like she is historically. Then we have Churchill coming in and doing what he normally does. His one-stop shop solution based on First World War experience of, we have to pause all large ships and concentrate on the small ships. I could imagine that conversation. Probably Henderson going, but we've got the small ships under construction. We need to get them built more quickly. We can't get them built more quickly. We literally have every stage packed as it is. Well, if we put more people, those people will have to be moved from the large yards to the other yards. They'll have to retrain and focus in on those things, and the transition will take forever. It will take a long time, and by the time they get there, it will actually have caused us trouble and delays. He'll do a full block defense. I could see Fisher getting involved as well, backing him up. And I could see there's probably going to be a disagreement, but it's probably going to end up being a balanced solution, in that Churchill's going to win on pausing some ships. I would guess the Implacables and Anson and Howe, and everything that's coming after them, probably even Lion and Temeraire. But I do not see Fisher, the former Director of Naval Intelligence, and Henderson, who actually knows how the ships are to build, accepting the idea that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are suddenly turned from fast battleships into battle cruisers. Because they won't. So that means, I'm guessing, they don't get to reclassify them on Churchill's orders, and therefore those ships are going to justify the continuation and building of the ships which you have supplies for. Now that's the important thing. The Illustrious class, Unicorn, King George V, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York, their items are already under construction. They're already timetabled. That work is already going through. There is realistically nothing holding them being completed back from being completed out on schedule. So I think probably the compromise is that they get to finish the Illustrious class as scheduled. They get to finish probably Unicorn, and probably, because again, she doesn't require the armor, etc. She's literally just building a ship. Pretty much. That's fairly easy, but probably completed in light carrier form rather than in her aviation support ship form. And the 3 of the King George V's as scheduled. And these ideas might change. Okay, as time goes on, they will probably get them. They will probably, even those ships which are paused, we've restarted. And I again could go through the cruisers, and it's probably the same. The cruisers which have been paused, the ones where the materials are already ordered and sitting there, you finish. The ones which aren't, you can pause. That sort of makes more sense. And actually, if you look at the First World War, it's actually what happened after the Navy negotiated it through with Churchill. Because Cabinet had wanted to pause them, Cabinet didn't get it through. The Navy negotiated and pushed back, and that was what happened. It was an agreement. It wasn't a complete pause. It was a, we're pausing these, we're going to finish these. The other interesting debate that goes on at this point is naval aviation and aircraft. And here is where you have a big problem with having a former Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, such Third Sea Lord, in charge of naval aviation. The Navy's just been passed, aviation has just been handed back. Inskip Award's just gone through. They have control of aircraft ordering. So if Churchill turns around and tries to concede in Cabinet again that the Air Force should take priority and then tell the Navy they have to take priority because they're fighting Germany and therefore they don't need naval aviation, I could see him getting killed. As in Churchill, but that'll probably not happen. I think the probable agreement that they get is either shadow factories in Canada take responsibility for building whatever it is of naval aviation they want, or they get an earlier agreement allowing them to go buy American than they did historically. Basically, the Navy agreement comes out in 1959. Okay, you can pause our construction, but that means we can go buy American now. You can pause the construction of the systems we want, but we can take our specifications straight to America and try and get them to build something that we to support us. Because that's the option. That's your choice. I once received a comment back where I talked about this lost generation of aircraft. Do you ever consider the reason they're lost is because they didn't exist? No, because I can actually show you the plans, the specifications, the orders, and all the testing versions being flown. I can literally go and show you the aircraft from the lost generation. They were lost. That was my response. So that means you probably still have things like the Albacore in service initially, but that means you're not waiting around for new aircraft to come in till 1942, etc. so on. You could go to the Americans in 1939. You could send someone like Lumley Lister, Casper John, there are a few options sitting around, across to America and start running orders. Again, it's not going to necessarily be popular, but it's going to be the compromise scenario they're going to push for. And the difference you've got is you have admirals who are, in the case of Fraser, he wasn't briefed up enough in the case and he wasn't experienced enough to push back, and Blackhouse just didn't have that style. Blackhouse didn't have that style, and neither did Pound, of being politically pushing back so hard on these things. Pound finds it as the war goes on. He gets stronger, more confident, but that's also as he's getting weaker because of his own illness. You're dealing with two people at the height of their powers who are not ill, who are capable of this at this point, in terms of Fisher and Henderson. They're going to push you back hard. They are going to push back hard. So I don't think you lose courageous. And I don't think you get a universal pause on all carriers, capital ships, and cruisers. And I think you get some kind of compensation for the lost generation. Instead of waiting, basically taking a year to 2 years to get into the mix of buying American aircraft properly, they'd be literally straight out in 1939 with a checkbook going, we want orders now. What's available in 1939 is interesting. You could be talking about things like a Brewster Buffalo with folding wings and probably more guns, because they only have 450s. Browning machine guns. They're good guns, but only 4 of them. The Royal Navy would want more. So that could be procured as the fighter, the single-seat fighter, which they had been working with Supermarine and others to develop a single-seat fighter for the Royal Navy's Interceptor. And various other options could well be pursued. There could be various options pursued. There could also be a scenario where they basically take the design of aircraft they've got under construction, like, the Barracuda, and go design it around an American engine. The RAF are using the Air Ministry wants all the British-built engines. That's fine. American engine that we can fit in it. And what would a Barracuda look like if it was built around a Wright Cyclone? That's an interesting thing for me to think about. But there are some very simple options for them to do to get production going of capable assets earlier, if they're given permission. And that's all they really need, because the checkbooks are open. It's very hard to argue that in September 1939 onwards, the checkbooks for the Royal Navy and naval services are not fully open. They are fully open. They just need someone to ask to push for it, to get the permissions to go and do this. And to be honest, I could see Chamberlain, especially if you're prepared to go around Churchill a bit, actually being prepared to agree to these things to annoy Churchill, because Churchill's made a grand gesture of, yes, we all support the war effort by letting the Emirs do this, and then the Navy goes, but we need this, and so Chamberlain's conceded it, which would sort of embarrass Churchill just a little bit. I'm not sure how that would be good long term politically, because as I said before, there are not really many very good options. There are really not many very good options for the for the British government to replace to have as prime minister in this time period. Churchill really is the best of the options available. So annoying him too much politically could cause trouble. But again, Henderson and Fisher are not only good at political management, so they probably make him look like it's his explain to him it's his idea. After all, that worked for a previous Admiral Fisher with him, Jackie Fisher. So, yeah. And let's be honest, he now has a Fisher again with him as First Lord of the First Sea Lord. So, yeah, it's Churchill and Fisher want a rolling Mark II. Which leads us to December to July 1940. And this is a really interesting period. A really interesting period. Now, with that all being considered, all the different changes that are so far add up, we've now got a slightly different scenario, because if you think about it, fall of France, all those things on shore are still going to happen. The Royal Navy will have slightly more destroyers under construction. They might have ordered the Flower-class corvettes a little bit earlier, but it's not going to change things, broadly speaking, at this point. No, where things are going to probably be felt in this scenario in December 1939 to July 1940 is going to be an increased presence of aircraft carriers coming into service. I'll be talking about those, the exact timeline of those later. But also, I think, with Courageous around with Glorious, I would suggest there be more air power supporting the Norway campaign. Does it change things? Does having an extra carrier battle group change things available? It's going to have an impact in some ways. It is going to have an impact in some ways. To be honest, it might be that Glorious has already been deployed back to the Mediterranean as part of the deter Italy strategy. By this point, it might be Glorious is already gone, and Courageous is now the carrier, providing the extra strike carrier duties in the home fleet. There are options for what other scenarios going on, but the thing is, it's unlikely you're going to have a carrier wandering around on its own. Again, there is a guy called Henderson. And even if we go with the scenario that of the traditional the scenario of Glorious having the issue she did, which led her to being on her own, that's probably not going to happen in a scenario if there's two carriers there. If they're operating as pairs of carrier, if there's more carriers there's going to be a rear admiral aircraft carriers there. There's going to be someone directly there who is directly responsible for the carriers over Norway, and who's going to be not persuaded by the idea of let's send a carrier off solo. It's safe. Because literally anyone in the command structure, if there had been anyone between Lord Corkenori and that decision, I think they would have said no. The thing is about Lord Corkenori is he's been a peacetime admiral for too long, is often my decision. And whilst he's a very good peacetime admiral, he seems to be labouring under the misapprehension, and this comes out in some of the stuff he says about Somerville, that there is a nice dividing line somewhere between what is a safe zone and a war zone at sea. There is peace on one side, war on the other side, and this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the war. And I would love to say it's only him, but there are lots of admirals on all sides who have the similar problem. And it's, I don't know, maybe it's a legacy of World War One, where there was quite literally a side where you were unlikely, very quickly early on in the war, there was a space where you were very unlikely to run into German surface ships. Very unlikely. Submarines maybe, surface ships no. So if you're proceeding at high speed and zigzagging, the threats of enemy forces were nil. But that's not that scenario in World War II. It's not that scenario. And it's certainly not that scenario where they were. It's not far enough away. So yeah, if you do have Courageous and Glorious there, you definitely have a Rear Admiral aircraft carriers there, because you have enough carriers that the rear. There has got to be someone who's directly responsible for them. And again, if the Third Sea Lord is still a naval aviator at the deciding table, it's going to be affected. We go with some of the new ideas, which are that, Churchill was sending them on a secret mission. That is something Churchill can play with Pound and Fraser and the various officers who were in the Admiralty at the time. But I don't think he can play that game versus Fisher, and I certainly don't think he can play that game versus Henderson. Both have been managing politicians for too long, and in case of Henderson, directly dealing with Churchill pretty much since World War I. Fisher's case, former head of naval intelligence, and had a reputation from that of being the type of person who didn't walk into a room unless he knew not only what the people there were likely going to ask him for, but knew what they had for breakfast and where they slept the previous night. And where they slept every other night before that. There is a different scenario in dealing with them. Will they be perfect? No. Will they manage to stop Churchill doing all these things? No. But a scenario where it's sending, any scenario where we consider that carrier going off on its own, with just a couple of destroyers escort, very unlikely to happen. Very, very unlikely to happen in this scenario. And that's one of the things you realise, is that the Royal Navy, when they lose the generation of officers, and just look at them. Look at the ones, if we go back again, think about who they've lost. They lose Blackhouse, who, was at least started in July 1939. He'd had some experience before the war took before he started in September 1938. So if he'd been around, he would have had some experience, but he's lost in July 1939. Sorry. He's lost. That's a full admiral lost. One full admiral. Pound is called up. Fisher, full admiral lost. Henderson, a full admiral lost. They lost 3, and this is just 3 of them. There are others I could point to. Full admirals lost in a very short space of time. There's quicker attrition going on Royal Navy admirals 1937 to 1940 than there is during World War I. They are dropping like flies. In this scenario, we're basically asking what happens if two of the better ones, the better political operator ones, are in the positions at the beginning of the war, which they probably would have been, and are doing those duties. Things are going to change on the political front. The political management of people like Churchill is going to change. It's not a stretch of the imagination or a stretch of the plausibility. And that's really the real loss. Okay, yes, a few more ships here and there, these things would have been useful. Yes, you're unlikely to have Glorious going off on her own, which means you have Courageous and Glorious around. You maybe have both of them sitting in Norway. You might have just had Courageous helping out in Norway and have Glorious sitting in the Mediterranean already. Who knows? The scenarios are fluid, but either way, you've got more options going on. You've got more options. And those admirals are not going to make these things invulnerable. The Royal Navy could still lose assets in other ways. They could still lose them. But the really big difference comes when we start considering what would have happened post-July 1940, August 1940 onwards, because Ark Royal had taken 39 months in peacetime to go from laying down to commissioning. She took 39 months. And there were interesting bits of that. Illustrious took 37 months, Formidable 41 months, Victorious 48 months, and Indomitable 47 months. That's quite a long time. Unicorn took 45 months. Implacable took 65 months. Indefatigable took 54 months. That's a long, long time. If we consider, in contrast, Nelson had taken 56 months to build, Rodney had taken 60 months to build in peacetime on a go-slow. That's time from being laid down to commissioning, 60 months. 5 years. That's one of the reasons, one of the things the Royal Navy did to try and keep the industry going was build Nelson and Rodney as slowly as they possibly could. As slowly as they possibly could. It's the same trick they do today, by the way, with the Royal Navy does with its naval construction. It spreads it out over as long a time as it possibly can in order to keep the yards and keep the facilities going. Which is why we say the yards are being run incredibly inefficiently, because they're actually paying them to run inefficiently. They're paying them not to build at full speed. They're paying them to take their time, to keep the capacity to build them. It does lead to the scenario where, quite literally, once you look at the cost of actually building the units, the Royal Navy pays for roughly 3.5 aircraft carriers, takes delivery of 2. It goes even further once you look at, Type 45s, Type 26s, the current, and Type 31s are the current construction. It gets really quite intriguing. But the King George V class, well, KGV herself took 45 months, Prince of Wales 48 months, Duke of York 48 months, Anson 57 months, and Howe 60 months. And the thing is, if you don't have the pause in construction on the Illustrious class, probably Unicorn, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York, as I already discussed, I've already explained, those are the likely ones not paused. The others will be paused to, give the sop to Churchill. Well, that takes at least 3 months, therefore, off their completion time. So if they're not paused, you take 3 months off the quickest completion time. And then, without design changes brought into them, it's probably an average of 3 months off the earliest time. So, you take the quickest build, let's say, for the Illustrious class, Illustrious itself is 37 months. Well, for her, you'd probably be taking 3 months off, and you'd say, well, that's roughly that's going to be 34 months to build. And so, Unicorn takes even less, as she's not going to be built to a full spec. She's being built as a light fleet carrier. And a King George V class probably take roughly 42 months each. Now, that would change their service entry lives to King George V, July 1940, Prince of Wales, July 1940, and Duke of York, February 1941. So in July 1940, you have King George V and Prince of Wales entering service. 2 fast battleships entering service. To me, that means things like Hood's refit probably takes place. Because you've now got 2 fast battleships entering service, and you've got another one coming in February 1941. That's not that long away. Renown's out of refit. You've got Repulse still hanging around. You've got enough fast ships. Fast capital ships. But it gets even more interesting once you look at the carriers, because they had been the real shortage. They'd been the thing which Henderson had been so desperate to redress the need for. Because it's in carriers, the numbers are far closer than capital ships. You haven't got enough space in your carrier numbers. Well, Illustrious is February 1940. Formidable, April 1940. Victorious, March 1940. And Indomitable, September 1940. And Unicorn would be probably somewhere in the region of June 1941. So she isn't available yet, but you've got 3 more carriers well into service. Well into service by the point you're forming Force H. You've even got Illustrious available for Norway. So you notice I said, well, Glorious could be off in the Mediterranean fleet. That's because Illustrious could be, and even maybe potentially Formidable, could be helping out in Norway. Probably not. Formidable's probably working up in the Caribbean. But Victorious definitely could be. She's probably coming back from work up. So Illustrious and Victorious could be available for Norway, along with Ark Royal, maybe Courageous and Furious. And let's be honest, you've probably had Furious operating, might have sent Furious over to Canada to act as a training carrier for the pilots getting used to American aircraft. Okay, it's on. You're having to order things like the Brewster Buffalo as a fighter. You got the Albacore and the Swordfish are perfectly good as strike aircraft at this point, especially for the night strike missions. So literally, the Furious, if it's doing anything, is doing a training for Brewster Buffaloes, which would be an up-arm version. But again, the Brewster Buffalo in 1940 is a perfectly adequate single-seat fighter for what the Royal Navy want to do with it. It needs slightly more firepower for their zoom and boom tactics. And yes, traditionally, one of the advantages of Fulmars is that you have the observer being able to act as a spotter and act as, help coordinate things over the radio. But the thing is, the Royal Navy has been practicing single-seat air defense fighter control for most of the 1920s and 30s. Yes, when radar's being implemented, the only aircraft they have which are single-seat fighters are Sea Gladiators. But guess what? Eagle tries coordinating with those too, and does fairly well. It's quite possible to do it with single-seat aircraft. The Battle of Britain, they managed to do it with single-seat aircraft. Yes, it adds complications, but it's nothing the Royal Navy cannot accomplish, cannot work out, and do not already have processes in place for. Those processes were mostly designed for a time pre-radar, but in many ways, a Brewster Buffalo fits more of the mold of the single-seat aircraft they've been using in that period when they're developing those, so it means that the change they've really got on is the radar, which makes life easier. And if you've got someone like Somerville heading that project, then you've got a very good officer running that. A very skilled and technical officer going to be pushing that radar. And so that's going to change things. When Force H forms up, it might well have a couple of carriers. In which case, putting someone like Henderson in charge of it makes sense. He's got a couple of carriers. Historically, Force H is formed up with Renown and Ark Royal. Maybe it's formed up with Renown, Ark Royal, and Victorious. In this scenario, you could keep two of the fleet carriers, armored carriers, the two Illustrious class, Formidable and Indomitable, let's say, for the home fleet. You can have Illustrious go and support Glorious and Eagle in the Mediterranean fleet, and Victorious and Ark Royal form Force H. That is a very logical scenario to deploy it out to. And suddenly that means, we need to do an operation, but Ark Royal's looking a bit knackered. Okay, well, but send her in for a refit. We'll do the operations with just Victorious. We can do that. For the Mediterranean fleet, if Eagle's looking a bit in trouble, well, that doesn't matter. We've got Illustrious and Glorious. So it changes things. This is why I'm not doing beyond this point. If you have literally just built to order those ships, the ships which they already had the materials for, if you have literally just done the bare minimum of political fighting back against Churchill, which Henderson and Fisher, as I explained, are more than equipped to do, you have this change in the first few months of the war. What does it do? It probably means that at least Taranto is going to be a multi-carrier operation. Rather than just one carrier, you're looking at least 2, maybe even 3 carriers. Especially if they've managed to keep Eagle, refit Eagle when she was first saying signs of trouble, instead of delaying it because they needed her in service, because they needed 2 carriers for the operations, and they only had 2. Whereas if they have 3, they can. It's more easy for you to go, okay, we'll leave 1 back. And the differential of having those 3 carriers launch a strike on Taranto, as I said, that quadruples your strike capacity of Swordfish. Okay, again, the Swordfish is not going to set lights aflame with how modern and how spectacular it is. But, as I've explained before many times, and I'm going to explain again for the purpose of those people who are watching this video and haven't seen my previous explanations, it is an absolute superstar at one thing: dropping torpedoes. You see, the Swordfish is the front of a lot of work the Royal Navy's done to make sure their torpedoes belly flop. Because if they dive, which most aerial torpedoes do, they go too deep. They will hit the bottom of a harbour, or they will run underneath their opponents, or even worse, they might just crack up on entry. You need a torpedo to belly flop. Now, most nations have developed fins to try and extend it out and worked on buoyancy and done everything they can. The Royal Navy have taken a step further. They added a tension wire, which unspools as the torpedo drops from the Swordfish, which provides just enough effort that it belly flops, and so runs straight. And that increases their likelihood of working and makes them far more dangerous. Now, again, I will point out that if you do not have Blackburn Skewer doing dive bomber duties in that force, there is not a chance in that you are going to get the Giulio Cesare. The Giulio Cesare. It's just not going to happen. It's just not. There's my torpedo dropping. It's not going to happen. And, well, again, usually they're fitted onto the strike carriers. That's when they were attached to, which were Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal, the Royal Navy strike carriers. Indomitable might get some as well, but, you know. The scenario would be Indomitable, if you're getting that sort of scenario, what you get is 1 squadron of fighters, a squadron of dive bombers, and 2 squadrons of torpedo bombers. That's the sort of formation the Royal Navy is looking for, which, by the way, is pretty much the same. It is pretty much similar formation to what the U.S. Navy goes for and what a lot of us go for at this point. It's a very similar formation. Now, what happens then? That changes everything. That just changes everything. And you've got those admirals running around. If you've got Henderson in charge of Force H, how are they going to handle Mirza Kabir? Henderson speaks all sorts of languages and also has all sorts of contacts in the French Navy. Will he get a different result than Somerville by a personal appeal? I don't know. I don't know how Somerville could have done any more, but I also know that Henderson would approach that differently if he'd been in charge of Force H. And I could see Force H being a very attractive place to send him, because it gets him out the way for Churchill back at home. And if he's too close to home, he's going to be probably too much of a issue for Churchill to deal with. Churchill likes admirals who'll do what he tells them to, and who can't organise things behind his back. Strange enough, though, he respects the admirals who do that. It's one of the things he likes admirals who don't argue back, but he doesn't respect them. He respects the admirals who will argue back and will try and go around him and organise against him, but he doesn't like them. And you can understand that to an extent. You can understand that. Honestly, I'm going to leave it open as to what you think goes from here with Henderson and Fisher and the changed Royal Navy, because it is open. It is beyond the area where I can legitimately argue what's going on. I think Norway still falls. As said, The extra ships aren't going to change that, and with everyone else still being in charge as they historically were, it's not going to change. Unless, I don't know, Henderson sent out and said Lord Corkenori, Lord of Corkenori to command the naval force in Norway. But if you do that, considering Henderson's experience and understanding when it comes to operations and his views on amphibious warfare, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the Navy and the the general forces being used far more aggressively. And who knows what that has an impact on Norway. I'm sure someone can wargame it with the British acting more aggressive in their landings and landing more quickly and having things more together. But again, that's to me an unlikely X factor. You're not going to get him out of the Third Sea Lord's office that quickly. He's going to want to train up his successor. He's going to want to train up Fraser, and also with organising all the war emergency destroyer classes and all the war emergency designs, that's going to take him a few months. The quickest you're going to get him out of there is May, June, July 1940. That's why I covered it through to this period. But there could be the scenario where he doesn't get Force H. He gets deployed to the Far East to try and manage against the Japanese. And the scenario that's going on there is he's going to start arguing for an aircraft carrier. And with modern carriers coming into service, and especially if you do have the free carrier operation against, and I do mean this, against Taranto, there is a chance that things like Furious, Courageous, Glorious, one of them, get sent out to him. And then you have a scenario, because then anything that's coming out to reinforce later on is different. But also, Hood's getting upgraded. Does that mean Vanguard's built? Or is it just Hood's upgraded? If you're starting the building process, and if KGV, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York are all in by February 1941, and you start building, do you finish off 4 battleships during the war? Historically, they finished off many more after this point, but you're going to be starting on. You're going to have the shocks earlier on. You're going to learn about Yamato and Musashi. You're going to learn about all these things. Do Lion and Temeraire get finished off? And again, if Fisher is First Lord of the Admiralty, that is going to be a different scenario, because as much as he does support carriers and is a bit of a destroyer man, he also likes his big guns. And his view on national security is going to be having them. So maybe you don't have Vanguard completed, but you do have modernized Hood, but and you also have Lion and Temeraire complete, and that's going to change things drastically. Because Lion and Temeraire become the 2 ships that hang around post-World War II. Definitely in that scenario. And with them having 16-inch 45s, well, there's a possibility that you at some point decide to go for commonality of the Americans. Maybe develop a 16-inch 50 or something, so you can share shells or change the breech. There's all sorts of options of ideas of what you can possibly achieve, and modernize too. And we haven't even got into the whole world of the big destroyers. Because again, if we think about the L and the M class destroyers, they come into service in 1941, 1942 and 3. Now if they're the big ones, and they're coming in 1941, 42, 43... they're going to be really interesting vessels to have coming into that service scenario. They are going to be really interesting vessels to have coming into that service scenario. They're going to be coming in at just a time in which AA weaponry is expanding dramatically, and they're going to have the deck space for it. Maybe, you take off one of the quintuple torpedo launchers, and you fit more more medium and light AA. You have the options with that design. But yes, my question for you, a question I put questions at the end of every one of these videos. Take this point. We've reached August 1940. I've given you the ships which are likely in service. I've given you the arguments and why I think it is, and I hope you follow along the logic. I don't really see it as anything controversial. I haven't argued space lasers or anything like that, which I just wouldn't, because it's not alternate history. That's science fiction at that point, and Glyn Stewart's far better at that than I am. But you do get a different scenario. You have a difference in scenario. Because as powerful as Churchill is, as powerful as the cabinet is, when it comes to making these decisions, the example of World War I still holds. If you've got experienced enough senior officers, look what the World War I Jackie Fisher gets. He not only gets the ship, accepts only certain ships being paused, but he actually because he goes, we have all this material already got. He gets them made some of the ships, 3 of the battleships exchanged for 2 battle cruisers, Renown and Repulse. So saying you just don't pause all the ships, you only pause some of the ships, is actually rather conservative. They're not getting extra ships built. They're not converting them to different ships. They're just getting the 3 most advanced, and with all the which have all the material sitting there, King George V finished off, and they're getting the carriers, which they've got all the materials for, completed. And to be fair, the forward aviation support ship / light fleet carrier built as scheduled because it was all ordered. That's it. No extra slips needed. No build construction adjustable. They are going to free up space in the yards by them getting finished. They are going to do that. They're going to mean that things like, oh, we've lost Royal Oak. That's annoying. We didn't want to do that. But look what we've got in service. It's going to be different. I don't know what the battle for Denmark Strait looks like at this point, but in the nicest way, in compared to historical, you're going to have a lot more carriers in service. And again, as I said, the simple answer to that, the simple pushback for the Royal Navy, which they could have done if they had someone thinking about it clearly, not Churchill, who thought he was being virtuous and doing it for the greatness of the nation, would have been, okay, fine, we let the ministry take precedence in British orders, we have to accept that because of the criteria. But we still need to man the fleet, so can we please go order them from America? Yeah, it's not going to affect any British industry. And if you want to get a ship aircraft quickly, you're going to get the ones which are available. I'd love to say they ordered the Wildcat, but that really at this point is not that good a bet. There's a reason the Buffalo wins in the competition in 1939. So yeah, I reckon it'd be the Buffalo. So you'd have air groups maybe in the Mediterranean of Buffaloes, whatever the British end up actually calling them, because they're still probably at the phase of renaming them, so they probably name them something else, which honestly the Americans might end up adopting, because Buffalo for a fighter, Brewster, what were you thinking? But you could end up with air groups in Mediterranean and North Atlantic of albacores, buffaloes, skewers. Probably something eventually to replace the skewer in the dive bomber role, because whilst it's a good dive bomber, it's not a good fighter, and it's going to... The trouble is, again, kind of like the Fulmar, it doesn't get enough investment in. Once it's built, it's basically the Air Ministry manages to get it ignored by Blackburn, like Fairey ignored the Fulmar. Their design teams have moved off them, and it's a case of, no, we need you to prioritise other aircraft. And fine, if that's when you do it, but that means without the next generation coming up, and although you need to be able to order from America, you need to be able to order from somewhere else. You need to be able to go and open out that checkbook. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I wonder if you all guess which one of these is the video on my actual birthday. We'll see. And what have we got coming out next week? Next week we have Sir Walter Raleigh. Of course, named for my poodle. My poodle's not named for him. I was told this the other day because I said my poodle's named for him, and I was told by the poodle that's incorrect. So Walter Riley is named for my poodle, not the other way around. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And thank you for all the super chats and support you do. They help me keep the channel going. Thank you very much, and take care.